So this is our last formal session together. For those of you who have seen the course through to the end, thank you and congratulations. I hope you found our time together worthwhile. By way of a wrap-up, I thought I might reflect for a bit on the so what question. Although our course may be ending, America's war for the Greater Middle East is not. It simply evolves. And as of mid-2014, it seems to be expanding. You may have noted in recent months the Pentagon's developing appetite for mucking around in predominantly Muslim countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The next front, the New York Times calls Africa. Just this past June, the Times treated the commander of U.S. Special Operations Forces in Africa to a flattering profile. "We have a real global threat," announced Brigadier General James Linder. "The problems in Africa are going to land on our doorstep if we're not careful. What better way to nip those problems in the bud than to send small increments of U.S. troops?" In Linder's eyes, the logic is impeccable. The Times correspondent assigned to the case could find no reason to quibble. So this MOOC comes to an end, but America's war for the Greater Middle East is sure to continue. In that sense, it might seem premature or even presumptuous to draw any overall conclusions, given what has occurred to this point in time. On the other hand, it's probably no more presumptuous than General Linder's plan to have Green Berets bring good governance to Africa's varied ungoverned spaces. So what should we take away from the material we covered? I make no apologies for the fact that I bring to this question the sensibilities and concerns of an American. That's who I happen to be. I don't pretend to be able to fully appreciate how these matters may look from an Arab or Israeli or Iranian or Pakistani perspective. I concede that others viewing things from a Coptic Christian or Kurdish or Pashtun vantage point will reach different conclusions. And not for a second would I dismiss out of hand the validity of those conclusions. Still, this is a course about what the United States thought it was doing and actually ended up doing when it so heedlessly committed itself to seeking a military solution to the problems besetting the Islamic world. So what are we to make of this war for the Greater Middle East, now well into its fourth decade, with no end in sight? Let me state plainly my own overall assessment of that war. We, and by that I mean we Americans, have not won it. We are not winning it. And simply pressing on is unlikely to produce more positive results next year or the year after. Hence the imperative of absorbing the lessons this ongoing war has to teach. Learning offers a first step toward devising wiser, more effective, and less costly policies. The 10 theses that follow constitute a preliminary effort to identify the most important of those lessons. Not all of what follows is directly attributable to actions taken pursuant to America's war for the Greater Middle East. Some of these issues predate 1980 and the Carter Doctrine. But in every case, U.S. military activities in the Islamic world since 1980 exacerbated these pre-existing tendencies. So let's begin. First, the center of gravity. Coined by the German philosopher Karl von Clausewitz, the phrase center of gravity refers to that factor upon which a war's outcome ultimately turns. The center of gravity could be the enemy army or capital. It could refer to some critical resource or a piece of valuable terrain. Correctly identifying the center of gravity doesn't guarantee victory, but at least you have an inkling of how a war might be or even whether it can be won. The war for the Greater Middle East began in the desert with President Carter's failed 1980 attempt to free the American hostages in Iran. Since then, the war has featured campaigns in other remote and desolate places. That said, Americans ought to have learned by now that in their war for the Greater Middle East, the decisive battleground is urban. In this contest, the outcome turns on what people think and believe. What matters most is not killing adversaries. U.S. forces know how to do that. But influencing populations. People constitute this war's center of gravity. And here, the United States labors under massive disadvantages that Washington policymakers have never taken fully into account. When American soldiers venture into this key terrain, they do so as alien intruders. They arrive in cities like Baghdad or Kabul as heirs of a Western civilization that has seldom acted to further the well-being of Muslims. U.S. efforts, therefore, are unavoidably tainted by the prior actions of Europeans, who, in attempting to incorporate the Middle East into their own empires, made such a hash of things. Like it or not, we are the successors of these imperialists. The West may be an artificial construct, one that today has long since outlived its usefulness. But having for decades declared that we are part of that West, we cannot suddenly divorce ourselves from its deservedly unsavory reputation across much of the Islamic world. Can the United States nudge the people of the Islamic world to think as we think, to share our views of God, freedom, family, identity, and the purpose of life? Ultimately, that's what winning the war for the Greater Middle East will require. If we are not capable of doing so, then we are engaged in an enterprise that is doomed to fail.